Picture yourself here. The cold, salty air fills your lung. The roar of the waves drowns out all other sounds. You're about to step off a longship into battle. But here's the thing. You wouldn't last a day, not even a minute. The brutal conditions, the weapons, the constant threat of death, it's more than any modern-day person could bear. Let me show you why. The Viking warrior was a master of close-quarter combat. Let's dive into the weapons they wielded, each one designed with one purpose: to kill. The axe, perhaps the most iconic weapon in the Viking arsenal. The battle axe, often with a broad, single-edged blade, was a symbol of power and a tool for destruction. Unlike modern axes, which are typically heavier and bulkier, Viking axes were designed for speed and precision. The hand axe was particularly popular, small enough to be wielded with one hand while the other held a shield, allowing warriors to strike with deadly accuracy. Imagine the force behind that blow, the sharpness of the edge cutting through a chainmail or flesh like a hot knife through butter. But the axe wasn't the only weapon the Vikings relied on. Swords, like the famous Ulfbert, were often prized possessions, a warrior's ticket to fame and status. These swords were forged using high-carbon steel, a rarity at the time, making them exceptionally strong and sharp. Only the wealthiest of Vikings could afford an Ulfbert sword, and to own one was to wield the power of a legend. The Viking sword was designed for both slashing and thrusting, with a broad, double-edged blade, perfect for cutting through armor, and a hilt that was usually wrapped in leather for a secure grip. Imagine holding one of these swords in your hand, the weight dragging you down, while trying to keep your balance and also fight off enemies. But let's not forget the shield, arguably one of the most important pieces of Viking gear. Made from wood, reinforced with metal rims, and sometimes covered in hide, the Viking shield was both a defensive tool and a weapon in its own right. The round shield could be used to push back enemies, to create openings in the enemy's defense, and to block strikes from blades and arrows. But in battle, a shield wasn't just for defense, it was for control. Warriors would form a shield wall, a tight formation of men, each using their shields to protect their comrades and push forward as a unit. This tactical use of shields made the Vikings nearly unstoppable in the early battles, allowing them to break through enemy lines with incredible speed. And then we have the spear, perhaps the most versatile weapon of the Vikings. Spears were used for thrusting in close combat and for throwing from a distance. The Vikings were expert spearmen, able to hurl their spears with deadly accuracy, piercing through armor and shields alike. But the lance-like spear, often used from horseback, was just as fearsome. You could strike at your enemy from far away, then close the gap quickly for the kill. The Vikings didn't just fight on land. Axes, swords, spears, and shields were equally effective when it came to naval combat. Viking longships were designed to carry warriors straight to the enemy's shores, and once they landed, the battle began in full force. The narrow design of the ships made them agile and fast, allowing the Vikings to engage in lightning-fast raids. And what happened when they clashed with enemy ships? The axe became an instrument of destruction. Vikings would board enemy vessels, swinging their axes into the wood of the hull, or into the bodies of opposing warriors. Once on board, the Viking warrior was in his element, using his sword or axe to cut down opponents in tight spaces with no room to retreat. Each weapon had its own purpose and its own unique advantage in the chaos of battle. The Viking warrior wasn't just an expert with one weapon. He was a master of his entire arsenal. Whether he was cutting down an enemy in single combat, or working in unison with his fellow warriors to bring down an entire battalion, every strike, every thrust, every swing was part of a deadly symphony designed to overwhelm and dominate. Now let's take a step back and look at how the Vikings fought, because their weapons alone didn't make them the terrifying force they were. It was their battle tactics that set them apart. The Vikings were not just warriors, they were raiders, skilled in the art of surprise, speed, and terror. Raiding was their bread and butter, and in battle they used a series of tactics that were designed to overwhelm and crush their enemies before they even had a chance to react. First, there's the Viking raid, a tactic that relied on speed and surprise. Viking ships, with their sleek, long designs, were built for speed. These ships could sail through both open sea and narrow rivers, making it possible for raiders to strike fast and retreat just as quickly. The Vikings would approach a target, say a coastal monastery, a town, or even a fortified village, at the break of dawn, when the defenders were least prepared. There was no warning, no time to assemble a defense. The Viking raiders struck hard and fast, overwhelming the defenses before the enemy could react. The Vikings didn't just rely on surprise, they also mastered the art of psychological warfare. Think about it. When a Viking warband appeared on the horizon, it wasn't just a group of warriors, it was a sign of doom. The image of the longship, black sails billowing in the wind, was enough to send fear into the hearts of villagers, traders, or even seasoned soldiers. And when they arrived, it was often with a deafening roar, a battle cry that sent a clear message: we will take what we want. The Vikings knew how to make an entrance, and that alone could make their enemies crumble before the battle even began. But raiding wasn't just about the element of surprise, it was also about the fearless strategy behind it. The Vikings, particularly in battle, often used the shield wall, a battle formation that was brutal in its simplicity. Warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, their shields locked together in an unbreakable line. This formation was nearly impossible to penetrate. It was like an unstoppable living wall of iron and wood. With their shields raised, the Vikings would advance slowly, step by step, until they broke through the enemy's defenses or drove them back. While the shield wall was effective on land, it was just as effective in naval combat. The Vikings would form a line of longships, each one closely packed together. Once the enemy ship was within striking distance, they would launch their boarding party. As the ships collided, Viking warriors would leap across, their axes and swords ready. But this wasn't just a disorganized rush. It was a coordinated, deadly tactic. Warriors on one ship would strike down the enemy crew, while others began to work on disabling the enemy ship itself, often using their axes to sever key rigging or destroy oars, rendering the ship useless. And once they took the enemy ship, it was theirs to plunder, or to burn to the waterline to ensure it couldn't be used against them. The Vikings were also adept at divide and conquer tactics. In battle, they didn't fight in the traditional formation you might expect. While other cultures fought in rigid lines, the Vikings often adopted a much more fluid, dispersed approach. Some Vikings would engage in direct combat, pushing forward with their axes and swords, while others would feign retreat, drawing the enemy into a trap. Once the enemy was out of position, the Vikings would surround them, cutting off their escape routes and picking them apart one by one. And let's not forget the role of the Viking chieftain in battle. Unlike modern military leaders, Viking chieftains often fought alongside their warrior. They weren't perched high in the rear. They were right in the thick of the action, leading by example. This gave their warriors something to rally behind, a living symbol of strength, courage, and leadership. Viking battle tactics were as relentless and brutal as the warriors who used them. From the terrifying raids that struck fear into the hearts of entire villages, to the unbreakable shield wall that could stand against any enemy, the Vikings were masters of the art of warfare. Their tactics weren't just about brute strength. They were about striking fear, using speed and precision to overwhelm their enemies before they even had time to react. Now, let's step into the heart of battle, the chaos, the brutality, the savagery of Viking combat. This wasn't about honor or glory. Not in the way we think of battle today. This was survival. This was the fight to the death. The Vikings didn't just engage their enemies with weapons. They engaged them with every ounce of ferocity they could summon. Every strike was meant to maim, to kill, to break the will of the enemy. When you stepped onto the battlefield, you weren't just fighting another soldier. You were fighting for your life. The weapons, from the battle axe to the sword, were designed for one purpose only: to kill. The Vikings knew how to make every strike count. Their axes, with their long, broad blades, were capable of cleaving through both shield and bone with terrifying efficiency. And the sword? It wasn't just for show, it was a tool of execution, built for precision and power. Combat wasn't just a clash of swords and shields. It was a grueling physical battle that tested a warrior's strength, endurance, and pain tolerance. The Vikings fought in close quarters. No distance, no room to dodge. In the thick of battle, the smell of sweat, blood, and fear filled the air. Muscles ached, bodies collided, and every warrior was locked in a desperate struggle to land that one fatal blow. Then there's the shield wall, a tactic that could both protect and increase the carnage. As the Vikings advanced, shields locked together like a fortress of wood and iron. But it wasn't just about defense. This was a push, a way to break the enemy's formation, to disorient them. In close combat, the shields were used to knock enemies off balance, creating openings for the warriors' axes and swords to cut down their foes. The Vikings didn't just kill, they maimed, crippled, and left their enemies in agony. The Vikings were skilled in disabling their opponents as much as they were in killing them. A strike to the legs, a slash to the face, a blow to the arm. Each injury was designed to put an enemy out of commission, to ensure they could no longer fight back. You weren't just fighting for victory. You were fighting to leave your opponent in such a state that they couldn't rise again. Death wasn't always swift. It could be drawn out in a cruel, agonizing way. And then, of course, there were the wounds, the ones that didn't kill. Infection was as much a killer as any blade. Without antibiotics, without proper care, a small cut or gash could fester, turning into an excruciating wound that would slowly rob the life from a man. Imagine being on the battlefield, your body battered, bruised, and bleeding, with no way to treat the injuries that were quickly stacking up. The pain of a battle injury could last for days, sometimes weeks, and it wasn't just physical. Imagine the toll it took mentally, knowing that death could come from a wound that seemed insignificant. The violence didn't stop once the battle was over. The Vikings didn't just leave their enemies behind. They often ritualized death, decapitation, trophies from the fallen, and even the display of enemy heads were part of the Viking way. The heads of slain foes were often skinned, preserved, and displayed to show that they had been defeated by a superior warrior. It wasn't just about showing strength, it was about psychological domination, making sure your enemies knew just how brutal the price of defeat was. Victory was never just about conquering land, it was about asserting dominance, making sure your enemies knew that there was no escaping the fury of Viking war. Maiming, torturing, killing, it was all part of the Viking way of life. Their battles were relentless, unforgiving, and filled with brutality at every turn. And when the Vikings went into battle, they weren't just fighting for land or riches, they were fighting for their honor, for the legacy they would leave behind. A legacy that said, "We are the unstoppable force. We are the conquerors of worlds, and we will destroy anyone who stands in our way." Every battle was a test, not just of strength, but of the very will to survive. And the Vikings proved time and time again that they were willing to do whatever it took to emerge victorious. But was it the battle alone that was brutal? Consider this. The conditions in which the Vikings fought were merciless. Picture standing on a frozen, mud-soaked battlefield, your boots slipping with every step as you wade through thick, slushy earth. The weather was no ally to the Viking warrior. It was another enemy that could steal your strength and your life. Fighting in the dead of winter, when the biting cold could freeze your fingers to the bone, was a test of endurance. The Viking armor, made of leather, iron, or chainmail, may have offered some protection, but it wasn't designed for the frozen hellscape that could turn the battlefield into a treacherous swamp of ice. The wind would cut right through their clothes, freezing their breath and making every movement feel like it came at a great cost. Frostbite was a very real danger in these conditions. Fingers, toes, and noses could cutting off circulation. A warrior might fight on, only to lose a limb to the cold later, permanently disabling them. Armor, meant to protect, became a trap in the cold. While it shielded against blades, it trapped sweat, moisture, and body heat, quickly turning into an insufferable weight. On a battlefield, you might be able to endure the fight, but the weather could wear you down just as quickly. And then there was the slippery terrain. The Vikings often fought on muddy fields or snow-covered hills. Imagine trying to fight, to hold your ground, with the mud sucking at your boots, slowing you down at every step. One wrong move and your opponent has an opening. Slipping could be the difference between life and death. A warrior with a weakened leg, caught in the muck, would be vulnerable to any opponent who still had his footing. And the cold didn't just affect the body, it affected the mind. The mental strain of fighting in such harsh conditions was immense. When you're already exhausted from fighting, the biting cold saps away your focus. Frostbitten fingers made it harder to hold your weapon. Shivering bodies slowed down reaction times. Every strike became harder. Every breath became a battle. But the weather wasn't the only thing working against the Vikings. Their enemies, whether other raiders, warriors, or soldiers, were also dealing with these same elements. Yet, even with everything stacked against them, the Vikings kept fighting. They endured. Why? Because their survival wasn't just about strength or skill. It was about grit, the will to keep going, to survive despite everything nature threw at them. A Viking's strength came from their resolve, the ability to fight when every part of their body screamed to give in. When the battle finally ends and the field is strewn with the fallen, it's easy to forget that the battle wasn't the only thing the Vikings had to survive. The post-battle environment was just as harsh. With no modern medicine, a small wound could become infected, turning into a slow, painful death. Even the cold wasn't over. Without proper shelter, the wounded Vikings could freeze, exposed to the element. Caring for the injured in these conditions wasn't just difficult, it could be impossible. And what about after the battle? The journey back home was no less treacherous. Imagine the trek through snow and ice, your body worn down by the fight, struggling through the frozen landscape, perhaps starving, perhaps wounded. The Vikings weren't fighting just for riches. They were fighting for survival itself. Even in victory, there was no guarantee of safety. Snowstorms, blizzards, and harsh winds were constant threats on their return journey. It wasn't just about the battles, they had to survive the journey home as well. Yet, despite the brutal cold, the treacherous terrain, and the constant threat of injury or death, the Vikings persisted. They were survivors, not just of battle, but of the land itself. Every day was a test. Every journey was a challenge. And for those who made it back home, there was a sense of pride, a triumph over nature as much as over their enemies. They survived the conditions that would break any ordinary man. But these were Vikings, and survival was in their blood. The Vikings didn't just conquer lands, they conquered the elements. And they did it with the grit and resilience that would shape their legendary status for centuries to come. However, the combat wasn't just about the fight, it was about what happened to the body and mind long after the battle ended. While most of us think of warriors as powerful, almost invincible, the truth of Viking warfare was far darker. It wasn't just the battle wounds that took their toll. It was the unforgiving nature of the fight itself. Physically, the Vikings pushed their bodies to extremes. Imagine fighting for hours, swinging your axe with the weight of fatigue pressing down on you. Exhaustion was a constant companion. After hours of grueling battle, a warrior's strength would begin to fade. The once sharp blows would become slower, more clumsy, until it felt like every movement drained his life force. Fatigue isn't just about tired muscles, it's about the shattered will to continue. A warrior who once stood tall with confidence could soon find himself staggering under the weight of his own armor, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. Every swing of his axe becomes an effort of will. And it wasn't just the constant fighting that drained the Viking warrior, it was the mental toll. War, after all, is as much about what happens in the mind as what happens on the battlefield. Imagine the mental weight of knowing that death could be just a breath away. You're surrounded by the chaos of battle, screams, clashing steel, blood spraying through the air, and yet, you must stay focused, must keep fighting. The mental strain of that kind of violence is almost unbearable. And after each battle, it was like the psychological scar of the experience lingered. You don't just carry the weight of your wounds, you carry the weight of the deaths you've caused, the fear you've endured. For many Viking warriors, battle wasn't just about winning, it was about the constant, crushing fear of losing. That fear wasn't just a fear of death, it was the fear of dishonor. To be killed in battle was one thing, but to be wounded and left behind, to be seen as weak or unworthy, was another. Death in battle was the only way to earn your way to Valhalla, the afterlife where warriors could feast and fight forever. If you survived battle, the psychological weight of that survival could sometimes be worse than death itself. And then there's the toll that injuries took. A warrior might survive the battle, but the wounds could linger, slicing through muscle and bone, leaving a warrior permanently maimed or disfigured. But worse than that were the infected wounds, often caused by poorly treated cuts, bruises, and gashes. In the world of the Vikings, there was no such thing as antibiotics. A small injury could fester, become infected, and turn into a death sentence. Imagine trying to fight with an open wound that refused to heal, the infection eating away at your body, leaving you weak and feverish. There was no escape. Infection was as much a killer as any sword or axe. Viking medicine was primitive at best. They relied on herbal poultices and simple remedies, but nothing could stop the spread of infection. Once a warrior was wounded, their survival was uncertain. What's worse, their comrades often didn't have time to help them. The fight went on, and the dead and wounded were often left behind. To be injured meant you were one step closer to death, and death was something the Vikings understood all too well. The Viking warrior knew that survival was never a guarantee, that each day they woke up could be their last. It wasn't just about endurance on the battlefield. It was about the daily struggle to survive the harsh realities of Viking life, the constant threat of violence, starvation, and disease. The mental fatigue of it all, fighting, surviving, and facing death, was a heavy weight to carry. And when battle ended, the warriors didn't always find rest. Many were left scarred, physically and mentally, from the trauma they endured. The Viking lifestyle wasn't one of glory and honor as we imagine it today. It was a life of surviving against overwhelming odds. And so, after the battle ended and the war cries faded into the distance, the Viking warrior would live on, haunted by the scars of war, both the ones you could see and the ones you couldn't. The body could heal, but the mind, the soul, it never truly recovered. The price of survival was deep, and it left a mark that no weapon could erase. Victory came at a price that few could truly understand. And for those who survived, it was never just the enemy they had to face. It was the unyielding toll that war took on their bodies and their minds. And in the end, the greatest battle was the one they fought within themselves. At this point, you've now heard about the weapons, the tactics, and the brutality of Viking combat. But here's the thing you need to understand. The true test of a Viking wasn't just in the fight, it was in the survival. The Vikings weren't just warriors, they were survivors. They lived in a world where everything from the weather to the wild beasts to the longship voyages could kill them. So if you think you'd last even one day in Viking times, think again. The reality is much harsher than any of us could imagine. Let's start with the journey at sea. Viking longships, while magnificent feats of engineering, were not comfortable vessels. These ships could navigate both open sea and narrow rivers, but that came at a price. When you were out on the open water, you weren't just facing strong winds and violent waves. You were facing the brutal cold. You'd be soaked to the bone, cold to your core, with no real protection from the elements. And it wasn't just a quick trip to the next. Long voyages could last weeks, sometimes even months. Imagine this. You're out there, on a ship, in the dead of winter, fighting off frostbite as the sea spray freezes on your skin. You're surrounded by your fellow warriors, all of you trying to stay warm. But there's no escape from the cold. The only way to survive is to keep going, to endure the brutal seasickness, the lack of food, and the constant dampness. No rest, no refuge, just the relentless push of the waves and the wind. And then there's the hunger. On a Viking voyage, food was scarce and often stale. It wasn't like you had a pantry full of choices. You ate what you could carry: salted fish, dried meat, maybe some hardtack. But after days of eating the same food, it became gritty, and often it was spoiled by the time you got to it. So, if you were lucky enough to make landfall, there was no guarantee you'd find something better. In fact, your next meal could be a gamble. One wrong move in gathering food and you might find yourself eating something that made you sick enough to die. But the fight for survival didn't stop at sea. When the Vikings arrived at a new shore, they didn't just face the enemy, they faced the land itself. The terrain was often just as unforgiving as the sea. In the harsh Scandinavian winters, the ground could freeze over, making travel nearly impossible. Even when spring came, the roads were often covered in thick mud, slowing the Vikings down and making it hard to escape or chase down an enemy. Then there were the animals. Wolves and bears roamed the forests, and the Vikings had to be prepared to deal with them. The Vikings didn't have the luxury of modern weapons or tactics to deal with these. They fought with spears and axes, hand to hand with creatures that could tear them apart in seconds. And when food was scarce, these wild animals were just as much a threat to survival as the enemy soldiers they fought in battle. Surviving the land wasn't just about finding shelter or food. It was about fighting off disease. In a world without modern medicine, something as small as a scratch could become a life-threatening infection. If you weren't careful, your wounds could become infected, and with no antibiotics to treat it, the infection would spread quickly, leaving you with only one option: death. And it wasn't just wounds. Diseases like dysentery from tainted water could strike without warning, wiping out entire crews before they even had the chance to defend themselves. So let's be clear, the Vikings didn't just fight on the battlefield. They fought against the land, against hunger, against cold, against disease, and against the wild animals that roamed the earth. Every step was a test of their resolve, their ability to keep going, despite the odds stacked against them. And that's what set them apart. It wasn't just their strength, it was their ability to survive, to endure. The truth is, you wouldn't last a day in Viking times, not in the way they lived, not in the way they fought. It wasn't just about being strong, it was about being tough in ways that modern life has never asked of us. The Vikings weren't just warriors, they were survivors in the truest sense of the word. And to truly understand their legacy, you have to understand how far they were willing to go, how much they were willing to sacrifice, to live and to fight. So next time you think about the Vikings, remember, their strength wasn't just in their swords, it was in their will to survive. And that's something no modern-day person can truly comprehend. Surviving the Viking Age wasn't just about strength, it was about resilience, endurance, and the will to keep moving forward no matter the cost. The Vikings were warriors in the truest sense, not only on the battlefield, but in every aspect of their harsh, unforgiving world. If you found yourself intrigued by the incredible toughness and relentless survival of the Vikings, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the history of these legendary warriors. Leave a comment below. Tell us, do you think you could survive a day in the shoes of a Viking warrior? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to share this video with fellow history buffs and Viking enthusiasts, and make sure to ring that bell so you never miss a new video. We'll see you next time as we explore more about the Viking Age, the warriors who shaped history in the harsh world they conquered.